So welcome back to the Revit project tutorials. This is set 5 of the tutorials, and in this set we will go through dimensioning and annotation, and then move on to construction detailing, rendering a simple view. So we won't go too far into that, but I'll show you how you can render a simple view, and then finally printing your working set to PDF. Now this first tutorial will go through the process of dimensioning and adding some annotation to your drawings. We'll just focus on the large scale drawings for the moment, and in the second tutorial I'll show you how you can create some detailed drawings. So by now you should have all of your sheets created. It's okay if you don't have all of them created yet, as you can create them along the way. Now I've got let's see, the few that I created from the last tutorial, and I'm just going to start dimensioning, and I'll dimension the large scale drawings before we hop into the detailed drawings a little bit later. So let's go into the ground floor plan, and this is my ground floor plan. Now the dimension tool is available in the Annotate tab, and you've got a panel for dimension, and you'll see all the dimension tools in there. Now if you hover your mouse over any one of these dimension tools, Revit will give you a brief explanation on what it is and what it can do. So there is a nice range there. Now I'm going to choose the linear dimension as a start, because it's the simplest dimension to demonstrate, and you just need to click it. There is a contextual tab there, and you can see that you can access all the other dimensions while in this tab. Now the linear dimension tool is pretty straightforward. Let's say that I want to dimension this entire wall here. Okay, if you hover your mouse over some of the elements, you'll see that points will appear. So let's zoom in closer here, like here. Okay, so you can actually snap to the intersection of two wall boundaries. You can also, if I move my mouse out a little bit, I don't know if you can see that there, you can actually see the endpoint of that. Let's see if there is a better view of that. It should appear as a blue circle. Okay, here we go, here's one blue circle, which allows me to snap to the endpoint of this particular wall, which also aligns with the interior there. It's a little bit difficult because this wall isn't at right angles to that one, so you may need to zoom in carefully to choose the point that you want to align to. Let's say, for sake of argument, I want to dimension from that point to this point, and if I press my tab key, I can actually access all the points underneath that. So dimensioning a linear dimension basically requires 2 points, the extents of the dimension basically, and pulling your mouse out, and the third point is where your dimension line would actually lie, and there's my dimension there, and it's from that point to the other point. Now dimension lines can be changed. Now this line here that you see, so that's the dimension line with the text above it. The line that is adjacent to that is called the witness line, and you can manipulate this witness line if you like after you've placed the dimension. And you can grab these blue circles, which are the anchors, and extend it if you like. Same with this one, although that's a different one. You can also move, if you can, grab that and move it to another alignment. Let's say that I grabbed that second circle there and I clicked on it, but I didn't let go of my mouse, so I can actually drag and snap to something else. Let's see if I can snap to something else here. Let's say I want to align it to that point instead, and you can see that the witness line has actually moved up now. Okay, so I can actually do it back here. Well, let's choose something closer to the core of that wall. So you can manipulate that dimension or that witness line after you've placed a dimension, and dimension should reflect the new value. Now that's just a straight linear dimension, and you can do it for interior walls if you like. So if you have certain items inside, then you can do that as well. Now that's not always done. Sometimes interior walls, especially if they're close to the perimeter walls, are indicated on the outside dimensions, and dimensions are usually kept away from the drawing so it doesn't interfere with the line work. But there would be some instances where you would put some internal dimensions, especially for rooms that are right in the center, or stairways, or widths, corridor widths. You put them inside the drawing just to indicate very specific measurement. So if you really need to, you can, you can place some internal dimensions such as so. Now I'm just going to quickly move on to the next dimension tool, the Align dimension tool. I'm not going to go through everything. I think a lot of them are very straightforward. But the Align dimension tool is a particularly nice one because it allows you to dimension entire walls very, very quickly. Now I don't know if I have an entire wall here that isn't appropriate. Let's try the Align tool first. Now if you pay very close attention to the options bar, you'll see that there are a few options here that you can actually choose to manipulate your dimensions. Now the first one has 4 options, and basically that allows you to align the dimension lines, or more specifically the witness lines. In here you see wall center lines, wall faces, center of core, faces of core. Now if I choose wall center lines and just hover my mouse over on one of the walls, you'll see that the center lines are highlighted for me. Now if I choose wall faces, you'll see that the wall faces instead are highlighted. Center of core is basically the center of the core wall, and when we define this wall, we define the stud wall to be inside the core boundary and the brick wall to be outside. So the timber stud is the core wall in this case, and so it'll give me the center line of the timber stud wall. And faces of core, of course, is the faces of that core wall. Now to quickly demonstrate this, and I'll just go back to wall faces, I'm going to move over to my car space. So I'm just going to extend this a little bit until I can see my car space here, and I'm just going to quickly draw, make sure you save your project, quickly draw 4 walls. And then I'll do some in between. They're very small, so don't worry about that too much. And I'll put a door in here. Let's move that swing, and a window. Okay, so to quickly demonstrate the Align tool, let's go back to the aligned dimension. I'm going to use wall faces because I want to align to the outside of the wall faces. And in here in the pick method, you can use the individual reference, which allows you to just create individual dimensions such as this. Notice it's the same 2 points, and then the third one is where your dimension line would be located, and that's relatively easy. I'm just going to delete that. But if you look carefully, underneath that is another option called entire walls, which allows you to pick an entire wall such as this one and pull it up, and it automatically dimensions it for me. So that's the entire length of that wall. Now if you look into the options, you'll see that there are options to for Revit to pick up openings in that wall, such as where the doors and windows are, as well as the intersecting walls, which are things like the interior walls meeting the exterior walls. Now I'm just going to choose intersecting walls first. Choose that wall again, pull it out, and you can see that it's picked up not only all the interior walls, but all the thickness of the walls as well. And that gives us a very quick way of generating some more dimensions, and it does it instantly, and it gives us a second level of dimensions, this time a little bit more detailed. I'll talk about that in a second, but let's bring up the aligned dimension again and go back into the options. This time I'm going to uncheck the intersecting walls and just check the openings. Select that wall again and see what happens. Okay, so now you can see that the openings are being picked up through the center line of the openings. So you can see that the dimension starts from the outside, goes to the center line of the window and to the center line of the door. I'm just going to delete that because that's not what I want. And before I do that again, I'm just going to move this out a little bit so we've got a bit more room. Align tool, let's go back to the options. Now here underneath the openings, it's got centers selected. Now I don't want centers, I want widths. In other words, I want Revit to be able to pick up the widths of the windows and doors for me. Press OK, now select that wall and bring it up. Okay, so there we go. You can see now that it's picked up the width of that window and the width of that door and the distance between each as well. So you can see that I've got three hierarchies here of, I'm just going to move this up so it's level, of dimensions. So we've got a very large dimension, that's overall length, and then a little bit smaller, showing the room size, as well as the thickness of the walls and the thickness of any other walls that intersect to the external wall. And then of course we move in and we're now picking up openings as well as distances between those openings. Now, dimensions are really meant to provide measurements of this building. So you should aim to provide as much of that information as possible without repeating yourself, of course. So if you were to dimension this side, you probably don't need to dimension this entire length of building again. It's adequate to measure or to provide measurements for just what's actually unique on this side. So if there isn't, so we really don't need to dimension that. So same with here, I'd dimension maybe the size of these rooms and the size of these rooms over here if they were unique. But if they're the same, then dimensions on two sides is perfectly adequate. Now, if you have walls that aren't orthogonal like that, let's say for an example you have slanted wall, like so, then you're probably best using the Align tool to dimension that, okay, which allows you to create a dimension parallel to that element. Now notice when I place an element, and you probably notice this throughout your modeling, that you see these blue dimensions everywhere. Now these blue dimensions are called temporary dimensions, and at any stage you can make these temporary dimensions permanent by just moving your mouse over to the dimension symbol that appears with the dimension and clicking on it. It should turn black and it should stay when you actually click outside that element. So that's a really quick way of dimensioning if you want to dimension along the way as you're modeling. I'm just going to delete that as well. Now of course there are other different types of dimensions here, such as angular ones, radial ones if you want to measure a radius, especially for curved walls, arc lengths, and of course we've got spot elevation and spot coordinate. You can also measure a slope. So if you want to measure the roof slope or a ramp slope, then you can use this to actually dimension the slopes. Now I'm just going to move over to our building, and this time I'll leave you to dimension the walls. This time I'm just going to dimension the grid lines using the aligned, this time using the individual reference, and it should highlight the grid for me. Except this time I'm just going to continue until I have a continuous dimension. Oops, let's try that again. I'll just do those three. Okay, so there's my dimension. Don't know what happened there. So you should be dimensioning grid lines as well if that's what you're using in your drawings. Now just a couple of things you should remember about using dimensions. Generally, they are kept away from the line work, so they don't interfere with the line work. Usually they're kept quite close to the building or to the drawing, so that the dimensions can be read in tandem with the drawing very quickly. So that's the whole point, so that you can actually quickly refer to the measurements on the side. Now there are instances where you do need to place internal dimensions, such as, let's say, corridor widths, and you can use that with the linear dimension or the aligned dimension. Either way, I like the aligned dimension because it's nice and easy. So there are instances where you will need to dimension internally, but keep them as to a minimum, otherwise your line work will become cluttered with dimensions and you may not have enough room for general notes. So keep in mind that you've also got annotation to put into your drawing as well. If you think about it carefully, dimensions are to provide measurements. So what sort of measurements do you need to provide to the builder to actually get this building constructed? And that will guide you along on how many dimensions you need, what to dimension, where to put it, all those sort of things. And of course, you don't need to overly repeat all of your dimensions. So if I've dimensioned the entire length or width of this building, I probably don't need to do it here as well, and same with the length. Now if I've placed dimensions along here to measure the length of the building, then in the elevation I probably don't need to do that so much. Okay, so in the elevation I don't need to provide lateral dimensions. Keep in mind that elevations and sections, you're probably more interested in heights, so that's when you start to dimension more heights than anything else. Okay, I'm just going to move on to annotation, and I'll leave you to finish off the dimensioning where it's needed. Make sure that dimensions appear on all drawings and not just one. Okay, so annotation is pretty simple. Annotation comes in various forms. It comes as general notes, which is just blocks of text which are placed inside the drawing to explain certain constructions. They also use in labels and titles and schedules, as well as cross-referencing. Now some of our labels are already there through tagging, so tags allow you to label things very quickly, but it also links it to a schedule, so that's another thing you don't have to worry too much about. Now general notes are basically just blocks of text that generally describe construction that is non-standard, but it also describes construction or elements that can't be interpreted easily through the drawings or through the dimensions. Now, annotation in form of general notes is just text, and text can be found in the text panel of the Annotate tab, and there's the text tool there. If we just click on it for a second and look into the contextual tab, you'll see that text comes in various forms. There's text with no leader, in other words no line and arrow attached to it, and then there's text with different types of leaders attached to it. So leader is just basically an arrow, and you can have a straight arrow, you can have a curved arrow, or you can have a segmented arrow. And of course you have justification as well, so you can have arrows on the right or left hand side. You can justify your text left, center or right as well. So the usual sort of word processing options that you'd see. Let's choose a no leader and move over to our drawing area, and to place text you can put a box and type in. Okay, keep in mind that it's very small. If you highlight it, I don't know if you can see that actually. There we go. We won't highlight for a moment. So let's select the text again. You can see over the left hand side that the type of text is has a font and a size, and so we can click in there and choose a size that will be most appropriate for us. Now the size that you see here would be the size that will appear on a piece of paper. So Arial 3mm would mean that the font is Arial and the size is 3mm as it would appear on paper. So how does Revit know to make the font or to make the text that big? Because in reality this building is huge, and so 3mm against this building would be very, very small. Well, Revit first looks at the scale of the drawing. It's looking at 1 to 50, and it knows that the text will appear as 3mm on a piece of paper, so it scales the text accordingly as it would look like if you were to put it on a piece of paper at 1 to 50. So it has the embedded intelligence. Now if I change the scale of the drawing to 1 to 100, zoom in into the text and notice the text is a lot bigger because the drawing would appear a lot smaller, so therefore the text has to be larger to still retain that 3mm height on paper. Let's change it back to 1 to, let's change it to 1 to 10 and see how small it is. So there it is, a lot smaller. Let's change back to 1 to 50, so we've got our proper scale. So that's our text without a leader. Let's insert a text, this time with a straight arrow, and process is the same, except this time I'm going to click once for the arrow and then click twice, and that's where my text appears. Okay, now of course I want this to be 3mm, so it's a lot bigger. Oops, let's choose that and change it to 3mm. Okay, so there it is. So you can see our arrow there. It's pointing to the wall and you've got a text attached to it. Now if you select the text, you can move it around the place. You can even rotate it if you like. Not recommended unless you really need to. And you can change the arrow to a segmented arrow. So it's very flexible. You can change the box. Okay, so you can adjust it after you've placed it. It probably is good practice though to, when you actually, before you place the text, to select the size first so it doesn't come out too small or too large. And just click outside when you're finished. Okay, so the process is very straightforward, but what do you actually text? I mean, what do you write? Generally you'd go for things that need explaining. So let's say that this wall is ambiguous and it really needs some explaining. So that's where you'd introduce some text with some further clarification about what this wall is about. And you'd include information like how thick it is. So let's say it's 270mm thick. Oops. What it's made out of. This is a brick veneer wall. And how it's constructed. So in this case you probably don't need that information, but in some other cases you might want to include how it's installed or how it's fixed, all that sort of information. Click outside, and I'm just going to move this so it's nice and condensed and not taking up too much space. Now, other walls such as this wall would most likely need some further explanation because it's just two lines. I don't know what material it is, I don't know what it is. Perhaps if I go to this section I might be able to see what it is, but you might want to include text here to help interpret that drawing. So you might want to, let's say, brick retaining wall. Oops, spelling's not good. There we go. And if you know what type of retaining wall, how it's actually constructed, then put that information in. If you need to go back to the wall type to see what it's made up of and how thick it is, then do so and insert further information. Oops, I'm just going to put okay, so there's my little bit of note there about that wall. Other things you might want to take note of as you're putting general text in your drawing is keep it clean and keep it neat. So if I were to put another, oops, let's save the project. If I were to put another note here, I'd make sure that the arrow would probably end in the same place as the other arrow would, and like so, and make sure that my text is nice and condensed and sort of aligned with everything else. So here the text is aligning, the arrows are finishing at the same place even though they do point to different places, and that's fine. So keep your text clean and neat, align them where you can, and try to avoid putting text everywhere in all sorts of patterns. And that's just a basic introduction to dimensioning and annotation. We will go further into annotation and some more detailing in the next tutorial when you start creating your detail drawings and putting some construction line work inside it. For the moment though, you need to go back into all of your drawings, all your building design, sorry, and go into all your views and start dimensioning all of the views and adding notes to all of the views. Please keep in mind that you have to have your drawing at a particular scale, so you might want to change your scale now before it gets too late, and this will influence the annotation and dimensioning. Now before we go, I'm just going to show you how you can customize the look of your dimensions and your annotation. So at the moment, let's say for annotation, we have a particular arrow, we have a particular text, and the same applies for the dimensions as well. You can customize this to have a different font, a different look, a different symbol, different arrow. And you can do that through some of the dimension and text settings. Dimension settings are available here in the arrow that we clicked on earlier on. Now, let's say we're going to change the linear dimension types. If you click in the linear dimension types, you'll see that you can access all the parameters that create this linear dimension. So here you can actually change things to suit. Now, once again, strongly recommend that you duplicate this into your own dimension style before you start changing values. Okay, so here we've got font types, style, width, even down to the tick mark, which is diagonal at 3 millimeters. So you can have a dot if you use a dot. I'm just going to leave that alone and let you change it. Remember to duplicate it first and then change it to suit. And same with the text, except text is in that little arrow down there. And you can access all the type parameters for this particular family type. Once again, make sure you duplicate so you're not changing the original before you start experimenting. Okay, so I'll just leave you there. The next tutorial will go through construction detail and we'll revisit dimensioning and annotation in that tutorial.